This is Artful Discourse, your weekly escape into the vibrant world of creativity, culture, and intellectual exploration. I'm your host, Benjamin Kirk, and I invite you to join me on a journey through the rich tapestry of human thought and the beating heart of artistic expression at Fresno State's College of Arts and Humanities. About a month ago on September 12th, the joyful sounds of drums rang through the Fresno State Peace Garden as the ceremony to unveil the Nelson Mandela Monument got underway. The life-size statue was the first in nearly 20 years to be added to the Peace Garden, a tranquil place at the heart of campus honoring peacemakers from around the globe. The Peace Garden at Fresno State was founded in 1990 with the bust of Mahatma Gandhi. Since then, monuments for Cesar Chavez, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Jane Addams were added over the years. Joining us today are Dr. Veena Howard and one of her students, James Myser. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Howard, you're a professor of Asian religion traditions and currently the chair of the philosophy department. You're the endowed chair in the Jain and Hindu Dharma, the director of the M.K. Gandhi Center, Inner Peace in Sarvodaya, and coordinator of the Peace and Conflict Studies program. So you are an extremely busy person.
Seems like it.
To get started, I want to get a little background on how the Nelson Mandela Monument ended up at Fresno State. I know Dr. Darshan Kapoor, Professor Emeritus, was instrumental in bringing the statue.
Yes. So it happened at the beginning of bringing, or the conversations of bringing Mandela to our Peace Garden started way before I joined Fresno State. According to Dr. Kapoor, the conversation had been going, but I was invited by our then provost, Dr. Lene Zelazny, to be this part of the Mandela Monument Committee. And I've been serving on the committee since then. And there was a group of members who are from community, from faculty, ASI president, our president, university president, provost. So it's very diverse backgrounds and professions and expertise. And we, as a committee, discussed all facets, all aspects of not only the monument itself, its placement, its how it will look, how tall it will be, what kind of attire it will have. I, as an expert in Gandhi, I brought more scholarly perspective to the relevance of Nelson Mandela for our Fresno State.
And Dr. Howard, didn't you also say there was a lengthy conversation on exactly what the fist should look like when he's raising his fist on the statue?
Yes, all aspects of how his fist is, that we had a longer conversation about it. What kind of fist, what kind of shirt. So I did some research on his shirts, and then we had only named Nelson Mandela almost toward the end when we were looking at the monument, and I really said we need to put his middle name in it.
Yeah.
And that middle name becomes such an important part of discussion in our Peace Gardens event.
And I'm going to get back to the name in just a minute, but can you just give me, I know Nelson Mandela is a widely recognized figure, but for those who may not know who he is, can you tell me a bit about him and why he's an important part of the Peace Garden?
So when we look at our Peace Garden, as you mentioned, Ben, we have Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, and Jane Addams. One thing is common to all these peace leaders is their fight for justice, liberation, fighting against racism, sexism, inequality. And if we look at these leaders, they're from different backgrounds. And Nelson Mandela is from South Africa, which is a continent far away from us, from a continent far away from us. And why is he relevant? Why do we bring him to Fresno State in our valley? And that I also really had to do my own research and soul searching about that. I just didn't come in the committee and saying yes to everything that was said. My moral duty is to raise questions. Nelson Mandela fought against this heinous, this inhumane system of the apartheid, which segregated South Africans from the whites, and Africans were taken all the rights away by the ruling party. So it was a system that was based on segregation on the basis of color, ethnicity, languages, and really denigrated the people of that native land. And he sacrificed so much. He dedicated his life to bring peace, to bring, above all, justice. And through his Truth and Reconciliation program, which is very, very unique and wonderful, that I think the world leaders need to adopt that. Yes, we all mess up. Yes, the world will have all these issues of colonialism, racism, violence. How can we address them? Even the post war, even the post conflict times. And I think we just move on and we don't do this. And Nelson Mandela shows a way how to repair. Many times we just put it together, we won, and we leave it, as we see in today's world also. But he was very interested in repairing the relationships, not only among South African tribes and different ethnicities, but with the ruling along parties as well.
Now I'm gonna flip around my script a little bit just because James and I were talking before the show, so I want to get your take on this. But James, first I want to introduce you a little bit further and ask you what your major is and kind of what your long term goals are.
Uh, my major is uh, my major is philosophy. I chose the pre-law option. I'm going to go once I graduate there. I'm going to have a certificate. I'm going to have a minor in peace and conflict studies and a certificate in legal studies, and also a certificate in social justice. Which, by the way, any student should be able to get from the philosophy department. Come check it out. But after that, I'm going to be going to the law school over on the East Coast.
And the reason why I wanted to bring you in early is because we were talking a little bit about Nelson Mandela and his time in prison and then coming out of prison, and you talked a bit about kind of that reconciliation that he had, that forgiveness or accepting of everybody that was in the country. Can you talk a little bit about that? What Nelson Mandela means to you in that aspect?
Well, yeah, one of the challenges that one of the other things we were talking about just prior to the podcast is that I'm previously incarcerated myself, so I understand being in lockup, and there's a lot of reasons you could hate your captors. There's a lot of reasons you could hate the people that were put in there, and especially after 27 years in those specific conditions. I don't think anyone I said earlier. I don't think anybody would have blamed Nelson Mandela for. Nobody would have blamed Nelson Mandela for hating those people even more than he already did. The critical part about Nelson Mandela was that he actually chose peace. He chose not to hate because he wasn't just. He knew that he was on the path to getting to overturning apartheid. That battle was gonna. He was gonna win the war. What he was interested in after the fact was actually winning the peace, and that required him to be able to practice that forgiveness because it's the old saying goes, if hate is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I think his famous quote was, chose to, he chose not to hate because if he had continued hating, he would have still been in prison, even though he no longer had the walls. So a major commitment of Nelson Mandela when he was doing his Truth and Reconciliation committees or commissions was he was bringing people together so that nobody could say that they weren't heard. He brought all the stakeholders together because if we're going to be members of the same ship of state, if we're going to share a destiny together, then we have to at least know how to work with each other, and everyone needs to be pulling in the same direction. I think that really what that kind of forgiveness is really the power of Nelson Mandela.
All right. So during the event at the unveiling of the statue, the keynote speaker was Dr. Siambiela Mandela. He was a relative of Nelson Mandela, and I want to play a clip of his speech that gives a little bit more insight into Nelson Mandela, the man, and really kind of talks about his name.
But when Chief Gadla named Mandela, his son Rolihlahla, which means pulling the branch. Colloquially, the message that he was giving to him was, my son, go and cause trouble. Kholihlahla in our language means the troublemaker. I do not know whether Chief Gadla had already envisioned the life that Mandela would live beyond the years that he spent with him. I do not know whether Gadla understood the impact that this name would have on Mandela and the impact that this name would have for South Africa, the role that this name on its own would play in the history of South Africa, in the history of the African continent, and in the history of the world as a whole. I would leave it to the historians to reminisce on the actions of Mandela. But I am aware that probably almost everyone here today know the kind of trouble that this man has caused. You know the cost that he has had to different forms of injustices, as we have experienced in the past in my country. We know the battles he has fought. Indeed, he went on to be the troublemaker. It is important to understand the need to cause trouble.
All right, and I'm gonna cut it off there. I was maybe gonna play a little bit longer clip. He goes on to talk about good trouble. So I wanted to kind of get both of your reactions to that section of the speech, because to me it really kind of struck the man and kind of delved deeper into him as a troublemaker in some ways, but also in how he was able to use that trouble to change.
Right. I think when we think about troublemaker, we always think sort of a negative connotation. If somebody is, oh, they are troublemakers, so can't be very positive, very good influence on the people. But here the word is, I think we should really think about good trouble. John Lewis called it, Senator, Congressman rather, John Lewis called the nonviolent movement of the US South and their leaders making good trouble. So the trouble is that it's really agitating the status quo. I think we get used to of structures of racism, structures of putting people down, structures of economic inequality. A person with a new idea and right mind who cares for others starts to ask questions, starts to resist those structures. So the civil disobedience, non cooperation, strikes, protests, there are hundreds of kinds of resistance methods that Gene Sharp, who was a great nonviolent theorist, wrote about. That all these are a good trouble to remove trouble. It's almost like works as it's a double-edged sword, what Gandhi called it satyagraha. Satyagraha or nonviolent resistance is double-edged sword. It's not only it is addressing the issues, fighting, he called it a weapon, fighting against those systems of evil. He didn't fight against, his goal was not to fight against systems or the people who are creating those systems, but the systems themselves. And it requires agitation, what they call it, agitators. All these leaders are called agitators. They're not sitting peacefully and meditating. That's why I think the peace can be kind of a very negative peace and positive peace. We're talking in our class with James's, the class he's taking is nonviolent philosophy of nonviolence and peace. That we can have a peace in the house. Every child is sitting quietly and they are so disturbed because they're afraid of their dad. That's what can be a peace. or they're running around and getting in trouble and being kids. That is real peace, where everyone has a way to express themselves. Everyone has a right to grow, right to flourish. And in South Africa, native people were not allowed that right. So he had to create rumblings, I call it, shaking the ground in order to bring people to senses, not to hurt them, but bringing to senses, because we forget where we are. That's why, as leaders, we have to be good trouble wherever we are, not necessarily on the national scene. In our own little worlds, we can be good troublemakers.
Now, I want to kind of turn this conversation to talk a little bit more about James. And, James is a student of yours, and you brought him in, or you invited him here today. And I, James, in talking with you, your story is just incredibly unique. And to me, it shows kind of the power of nonviolence. And I kind of want to delve into that as far as how these philosophies are impacting you as a student and what you're taking away from that. So I want to start off giving you a little bit of, have you give a little bit of your background. We talked a little bit before the show, and one thing I didn't realize is you had told me about your youth being a little bit violent and that you were incarcerated for a time. Can you maybe just briefly talk about that?
Oh yeah, extremely. And it wasn't just not even just necessarily as a matter of the environment that I was in, although that had a lot to do with it. But when you're a kid, you don't have control over your emotions, and sometimes it just becomes sometimes it just becomes matter of fact. Violence is in a sense its own language. When you speak it, you speak it. You start having conversations in those terms. The problem with violence, though, is that it's a lot of the times it comes to why are we doing it? Because usually it's about three reasons in my experience. Number one, it's just expedient. I'm not getting my way fast enough. I think that's where when we're actually causing the commitment to nonviolence in social movements, I think that's the one it has the hardest time with, is just because change doesn't happen very quickly, and we'd like to see it happen a little faster. It's also can be an expression of negative emotion. You are in pain, or you're hurting, or you actively hate somebody else, so you're just expressing it that way. And sometimes violence is just a reaction to the threat that you're feeling at the time. So I think one of the interesting things about, and just to kind of bring it back to Nelson Mandela for 2 seconds, but then I want to bridge onto Gandhi, because we're discussing these ideas. After the unveiling of the ceremony, Dr. Mandela, had a back and forth. He had a Q&A session with President of ASI, Faith Van Hoven. One of the topics of conversation, since we're mentioning the importance of names in the culture,
Yeah.
when he was the named puller of the branch, that was right after he was born. But there's also a convention with a kind of a coming of age, a bar bat mitzvah, if you like, where he gained a second name. I'm not going to try to pronounce because I'm going to butcher it, but it was the convener of the convener of the convention, or the convener of the conversation. He wasn't just there to start the trouble. He was there to actually bring everybody together. And specifically, the name Mandela was one of the five tribes, and the actual history there is it was one of the five tribes in South Africa, and each tribe had a different role. And the Mandela tribe, the fifth tribe, their entire job was to bring everything together. I mean, you take a look at all of this history, and after a while, coincidence starts to look like destiny, doesn't it? The Taking it to Gandhi a little bit, I'm hoping that Dr. Howard gets an opportunity to talk about the concept of ahimsa a little bit more, and about how the distinction between pacifism and passivity it's not the same thing. So the trick becomes, how do you actually we have a moral obligation to resist with nonviolent force, any all these things that are actually causing harm and suffering to other people. I think one of the reasons why Gandhi originally was committed to nonviolence was because the British wanted him to be. It's like the British want to have this fight where they have machine guns and we don't. So we're not going to have that. We're not going to fight it on that battlefield. We're going to fight it on the moral battlefield, where we never give up the high ground, because there they don't have any weapons. The point of ahimsa is literally A is negation, HIMSA is harm. So, or it's literally the nonviolence is the non-harm. When we're discussing Sarvodaya, which is one of the challenges, which is one of the principles I'm actively trying to apply with the work that I do with some of these younger kids. Uh, Sarvodaya is, in very simple, plain English terms, it's just the uplift of all. It is the moral and ongoing commitment to uplifting everyone else, to uplifting all in whichever way that you possibly can. It's extremely difficult to do that when we're being violent, but we just have to not allow ourselves. We have to not allow ourselves the expediency of resorting to violence because. And I don't often like quoting Ayn Rand, but she once said that force and mind are opposites. Logic ends where the gun begins. Fortunately, it's we rely a little bit too much on violence. We resort to it a little too easily.
Do you have anything to add?
Aren't we proud of our students, Ben?
I was going to
Yeah,
say he did a very he invoked you, but then did an excellent job of
did it
explaining
really?
it. Yeah.
And that's the way what happens in those classes. Sometimes I worry, are they listening to me? How much they are ingesting, how much they're taking, and then you showed. It's really, you made me pass. I always give myself grade. I passed. So I think that what you just said, the Sarvodaya, I just want to add the uplift of all, which is our also Gandhi Center's inner peace and Sarvodaya.
Mhm.
Uplift of all is not simply we think about our own kind or downtrodden, uplift of those who are oppressing us as well. And I think that's what the difference between other leaders and Mandela, Gandhi, and MLK, and Jane Addams, all this would be, because by bestowing humanity to those people, you're opening the door to the others to be humans and experience that love, experience that kindness. When Mandela sat with his opposing party who have oppressed South Africans for so long and had a meal with his wife and sat with him. Think about what that person's heart is saying that, oh my goodness, I'm treating these people so badly. And now this person is exercising so much love and care for me. And that is ahimsa. Not only just you think about your own kind, but you think about the one who is inflicting suffering on you as well. And that's the high moral ground.
Mhm.
That's the high moral ground these leaders are teaching. And I think our students get it. And that's my joy of it. Scholars may not get it, but my students get this. And it's really um, hopeful. I'm very, very hopeful for the future.
Now, James, you're also a veteran of the Iraq War, and we're talking beforehand, and you've seen some horrific acts of violence. And first of all, just thank you for your service. Truly, thank you for your
Thank you for
service.
paying your taxes. Combat pay was nice.
And I want to bring that as a veteran. Does that add another layer of your belief in nonviolence?
Um, General Eisenhower, I think he was president at the time. He might not have been, but he said that he hates war as only a man who has fought it ever could. I told a story in one of our seminar classes about a legend in the Marine Corps named Smedley Butler, who started off as enlisted, got out as a 2-star general after I think 33 years in service, fighting every war that America wanted to throw him at, and his big takeaway from his entire life in military service was that war is a racket and we should avoid it at absolutely all costs. So I can't commit to complete pacifism just because there are certain instances where when there is a principle of imminence and you have to save somebody else's life, I can't commit to complete pacifism. But what I will do is I will actually put myself in a situation where I can take the burden of possibly dying away from the victim and place it upon myself, and then I can work it out with the person that's causing the violence in the first place. At least that seems to have some sort of voluntarism and ethical parity where we can mitigate the total harm caused. But the challenge with one of the nice parts, one of the things that people kind of gloss over is when we're at war, it's not just we aren't just taught how to kill, we're also taught how not to kill. I was very fortunate where even with some of the stuff I was able to see, I was also able to I was empowered to not take life when I was empowered to not take life. So there are a couple of people that are walking around because our strong adherence to ethical principles and the law of armed conflict said, no, don't take the shot. I got to tell you, it's no fun looking at somebody through a rifle scope. It really isn't fun, especially not when they're a kid. But thankfully, it's principal commitments allow us to avoid those situations and minimize the harm overall. And the whole point of the laws of armed conflict is to minimize harms to innocent civilians. So if we have to go out of our way to take a little bit more harm upon ourselves, we'd rather do that. We'd rather do that than to unnecessarily visit it upon somebody who didn't choose to be in the conflict to begin with.
Well, thank you for that. I want to move forward a little bit. We just have a few minutes left, but I do want to get to this. I want you to tell me a little bit about what your work now is, especially with Focus Forward in the Veterans Treatment Court.
So I'm often telling, I'm older than a lot of the kids on campus, so I'm often telling them the life is what happens off campus. And specifically the work that I'm doing there has to do with Focus Forward. It's specifically mentoring kids that are exactly where I was 25 years ago. And one of the major challenges that you have is that once you're branded a convicted felon, then it's very difficult to get past that. I found Focus Forward through Project Rebound. Project Rebound does brilliant work on this campus. And one of the major things that I do with them is I speak to classes and we try to break down the stigma. So with Focus Forward, I work with kids while they're in custody and then when they're out of custody, and I specifically work on helping them transition from into out of custody. Because if you can, probably the best way to put it, we all have had transitional periods in our lives. We didn't start off going to college. We had a first aid school, right? And when you jump into school for the first day, everything is new. This is this giant place. You don't know where anything is. It's a culture shock. It's a different structure. It's a different bureaucracy than you might have been used to. So if you imagine the transition that happens when you go from in custody to out of custody, it's like that. Since a big part of what they need to do is they need to get a job or they need to go to school, that's a double transition that they're having to deal with all at the same time. So it becomes a question of what kind of supportive services do they have, and what kind of mentorship do they have to actually help them through? Because I've been through it, I've had to have those awkward conversations about what's that new piece of jewelry on my ankle, and why was I gone for so long, and what did you do, and oh my God, this and that. I've already been down that path. I'm able to kind of help the kids understand where the pitfalls are going to be. With the Veterans Treatment Court, it's kind of the same job. It's just a little bit different. It's a court where when a veteran gets in trouble, and typically there's a substance abuse element to it. A lot of us like to self-medicate with alcohol or drugs, honestly. But whenever there's that kind of an element to it, I go into court, I get to advocate on their behalf hopefully keep them out of jail and in the program. But the most important part of it is that whenever they're not in court, whenever they are struggling, they can still reach out to me, and I'm still talking to them because they still have a buddy who's willing to listen and who cares that they make it through. And it's the same thing with the kids with Focus Forward. Now that a lot of my guys are out, I'm still reaching out to them because they have that one adult that's not a member of their family, that's not a part of the system, that has actively demonstrated that they care that they succeed.
Thank you so much for Dr. Howard and James for joining us today. We are out of time. It was such a great conversation, and I just want to thank you both for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Artful Discourse is a production of the College of Arts and Humanities at California State University, Fresno. The Dean is Dr. Honora Chapman, and the Associate Dean is Dr. Sergio Laporta. This program is written, directed, and produced by me, Benjamin Kirk, the college's communication specialist. The theme song for Artful Discourse is Maiden Voyage by Fresno State music professor Benjamin Boone from his album, Joy. More information about his music can be found at benjaminboone.com. Special thanks to KFSR and FSR Underground General Manager Julie Lindahl for making this show possible. You can learn more about the College of Arts and Humanities and find an archive of our shows at our website, cah.fresnostate.edu, or on our blog, fresnostatecah.com.